The story of Accel Partners Venture Capital. May 26, 2005. Palo Alto, California. The headquarters of Accel Partners sits in the heart of Silicon Valley, but the atmosphere inside feels different today. Jim Breyer, the firm's managing partner, has just finished a series of intense meetings. For months, his team has been deliberating over a single decision that could either make or break their reputation. The investment they're about to announce will be remembered as either brilliant foresight or catastrophic overconfidence. The company they're betting on is barely 15 months old. It has only 10 employees. It generates zero revenue. Most venture capitalists who've looked at it have passed, calling it a college fad that will never scale beyond universities. Some think it's just another social network in an already crowded space where Friendster is fading and MySpace dominates. The valuation they're offering seems absurd to many, $98 million for a website that college students use to rank each other's photos and check relationship statuses. But Breyer sees something others don't. He's committing $12.7 million for 10% of Facebook. This investment will become the most lucrative in venture capital history. By the time Facebook goes public in 2012, Accel's stake will be worth $6.6 billion. That's a return of more than 500 times their initial investment in just 7 years. This wasn't luck. This wasn't a gamble. This was the culmination of a philosophy that Arthur Patterson and Jim Swartz had been developing since they founded Accel in 1983. They called it the prepared mind, drawn from Louis Pasteur's famous quote that chance favors the prepared mind. For more than 2 decades before Facebook, Accel had been systematically building the frameworks, relationships, and pattern recognition capabilities that would allow them to see what others couldn't. They developed deep focus areas, invested in understanding industries before they became hot, and built networks that gave them access to the most promising founders before anyone else knew they existed. The Facebook investment reveals everything about what made Accel different. While other firms chased the hottest trends and competed for the most hyped deals, Accel spent years preparing their minds to recognize certain patterns. They studied how network effects compound. They understood user behavior in ways that came from investing in internet infrastructure companies in the 1990s. They had built relationships with early employees at Google and other successful consumer internet companies who could provide reference checks on Mark Zuckerberg. They had Jim Breyer, who had the patience and conviction to spend months convincing his partners that this unproven college project could become something extraordinary. But this moment didn't just reveal Accel's investment philosophy. It showed their structural advantages. They had permanent capital from long-term limited partners who trusted them enough to bet on companies with no revenue. They had a partnership culture where senior partners like Breyer could champion unconventional investments without being overruled by committee consensus. They had developed relationships across Silicon Valley that gave them information advantages, from understanding what technical talent thought of Zuckerberg to knowing which other investors were circling the deal. The story of Accel is not the story of one great investment. It's the story of how 2 men who started their careers at the very beginning of venture capital built a firm that could consistently identify and back the founders who would define each technology generation. From investing in networking companies when the internet was still academic, to backing collaboration software when remote work was still uncommon, to funding Indian startups when most Silicon Valley firms ignored emerging markets, Accel's history reveals a pattern of arriving early to transformational trends because they had done the work to prepare their minds. This is the complete story of Accel, a venture capital firm that has been at the center of technology for more than 40 years. It's about the people who built it, the philosophy that guided them, the historic moments that tested them, and the companies they helped create that changed how billions of people live and work today. To understand why Accel could make that Facebook investment in 2005, we need to go back to where it all began, to 1983, when 2 venture capitalists decided that the future of technology required a different approach to investing. The year 1983 was a pivotal moment in American technology. The personal computer revolution was just beginning. IBM had introduced its PC only 2 years earlier, in 1981. Apple had launched the Lisa computer that same year, 1983, though it would fail spectacularly. Microsoft was still a small software company with only about 200 employees, working on what would become Windows. The internet as we know it didn't exist. ARPANET, the military and academic network that would eventually become the Internet, connected only a few hundred computers. There was no World Wide Web, no browsers, no email as a consumer product. The venture capital industry was tiny, almost unrecognizable compared to today. In 1983, the entire venture capital industry in the United States deployed less than $3 billion per year. Compare that to 2024, when venture capitalists invest hundreds of billions annually. There were perhaps only a few dozen active venture capital firms in Silicon Valley. Most investors focused on traditional industries like manufacturing, healthcare equipment, or retail. Technology investing was considered exotic and extremely risky. The firms that did invest in technology companies were mostly generalists. They would invest in anything that seemed promising, from semiconductor companies to software to telecommunications equipment to biotech. Very few firms specialized exclusively in technology. Even fewer had developed systematic ways to evaluate early-stage technology companies. Investing was largely based on personal relationships, gut instinct, and financial projections that founders created on spreadsheets. There were no established frameworks for thinking about network effects, winner-take-all dynamics, or how software economics differed from hardware. Into this world came Arthur Patterson and Jim Swartz, two men who had spent the previous several years learning the venture capital business at other firms and who believed that technology deserved specialized, focused attention. They weren't coming into venture capital from business school or banking, the typical routes today. They had learned by doing, by working at pioneering venture firms and making investments themselves. Arthur Patterson had started his career at Citicorp Venture Capital in the 1970s. This was one of the earliest corporate venture capital arms, backed by Citibank's vast resources but operating with the agility of an independent firm. At Citicorp, Patterson learned how to evaluate early-stage companies, how to structure deals, and how to work with entrepreneurs. He saw firsthand which investments succeeded and which failed, beginning to develop pattern recognition for what made technology companies work. After Citicorp, Patterson moved to Adler & Company, a venture firm founded by Fred Adler, one of the pioneering investors in technology. At Adler & Company, Patterson became a general partner, leading investments and sitting on boards. He was learning not just how to pick companies, but how to help them grow, how to recruit executives, how to navigate the challenges that young companies face. Jim Swartz followed a similar path. He had studied engineering at Harvard, giving him technical depth that many venture capitalists lacked. After graduating, he earned a master's degree in industrial administration from Carnegie Mellon, combining technical knowledge with business acumen. He worked as a management consultant before entering venture capital, which taught him how to analyze businesses systematically. Like Patterson, Swartz started at Citicorp Venture Capital in the early 1970s, when the firm was among the most active technology investors. In 1978, Swartz partnered with Fred Adler to found Adler & Company, becoming its founding general partner. For 5 years, from 1978 to 1983, Swartz made investments, worked with entrepreneurs, and developed his own thesis about what made technology companies succeed. By 1983, both Patterson and Swartz had reached similar conclusions. The venture capital industry was changing. Technology was going to be bigger than anyone imagined. The personal computer revolution would create thousands of new companies, and eventually millions of them. Software would become more important than hardware. Networks and communications would transform how businesses operated. But most venture capitalists weren't prepared for this transformation. They were still thinking about technology the old way, as discrete products sold through traditional channels with conventional business models. Patterson and Swartz believed that technology required a different approach. It required deep specialization, not generalist investing. It required patient capital that could support companies through multiple product cycles. It required systematic thinking about trends, not just opportunistic deal making. It required building relationships with entrepreneurs before they were famous, understanding technology directions before they were obvious, and developing expertise in specific domains rather than trying to know everything about everything. So in 1983, Patterson and Swartz decided to leave Adler & Company and start their own firm. They would call it Accel, short for acceleration, because they wanted to accelerate the development of technology companies and accelerate the transformation they saw coming. They raised their first fund, Accel Capital LP, with $64.1 million in committed capital. For context, that was a mid-sized fund for the time, neither tiny nor enormous. It was enough to make meaningful investments in early-stage companies, but not so large that they needed to chase huge exits to return the fund. The decision about where to locate the firm revealed their thinking. They chose Palo Alto, California, in the heart of what was becoming Silicon Valley. But they deliberately did not take office space on Sand Hill Road, the street where most venture capital firms clustered. They wanted to be close to entrepreneurs, not close to other investors. They wanted to build relationships with founders at Stanford University, at emerging technology companies, at research labs. They didn't want to spend their days having lunch with other venture capitalists on Sand Hill Road, competing for the same deals, thinking the same thoughts, and following the same trends. From the very beginning, Patterson and Schwartz established a philosophy that would guide Accel for decades. They called it the prepared mind, based on Louis Pasteur's observation that in the fields of observation, chance favors only the prepared mind. What did this mean in practice? It meant that Accel would not be opportunistic investors who chased whatever seemed hot. Instead, they would develop deep expertise in specific technology domains. They would study trends years before they became obvious. They would build relationships with technical experts, academics, and entrepreneurs in areas they cared about. They would develop frameworks for understanding how technologies evolved, how markets developed, and what kinds of founders succeeded. The prepared mind philosophy meant doing homework before making investments. It meant that when an entrepreneur walked through the door with a new idea, the Accel partners would already understand the technology domain, the competitive landscape, the potential customers, and the challenges the entrepreneur would face. They wouldn't need to spend months learning about an industry after making an investment. They would already know, because they had prepared their minds in advance. This wasn't just an investment philosophy. It was a talent development philosophy. Patterson and Schwartz believed that venture capital was a craft that had to be learned through experience, through successes and failures, through deep study of industries and companies. They would hire people who were curious, who wanted to become experts, who were willing to spend years learning before they became great investors. They wouldn't hire people who just wanted to make quick money or who thought venture capital was about financial engineering. They wanted people who cared about building companies and who would develop the judgment that only comes from experience. The structure of Accel reflected these values. Patterson and Schwartz created a partnership where decisions were made collaboratively but where individual partners could champion investments they believed in. They didn't want a bureaucratic committee structure that would slow down decision-making or force consensus investments that no one really loved. But they also didn't want a free-for-all where partners competed with each other or where the firm lacked coherent strategy. They built a culture of intense debate where partners would challenge each other's thinking, stress-test investment theses, and help each other avoid mistakes. But once a decision was made, everyone would support it. This culture meant that Accel could move quickly when opportunities arose. While other firms were scheduling multiple partnership meetings to debate an investment, Accel could move fast if a partner had done the work to prepare their mind and could articulate why an opportunity was compelling. This speed advantage would prove crucial over and over again in Accel's history, allowing them to win competitive deals and build relationships with founders who appreciated decisiveness. The first fund, launched in 1983 with $64 million, focused on areas where Patterson and Schwartz had developed expertise. They invested in telecommunications, networking, software, and media companies. These were areas at the intersection of computing and communications, which they believed would be transformative as networks became more important. They weren't investing in personal computer hardware, which was crowded and competitive. They weren't investing in semiconductor manufacturing, which required huge capital and faced brutal competition. They were looking for companies that would benefit from the coming wave of networked computing, even though that wave was still years away. The early investments from that first fund revealed Accel's approach. They backed companies that were building infrastructure for the internet before most people knew what the internet was. They invested in companies developing software tools that would help other companies build applications. They funded entrepreneurs who had deep technical expertise and who were solving real problems, not just chasing market hype. Many of these investments didn't become household names, but they were successful. They returned capital to Accel's limited partners and proved that the prepared mind philosophy worked. One of the early notable investments was in Unet, one of the first commercial internet service providers. In the early 1990s, when most people had never used email and the World Wide Web didn't exist yet, Accel backed UNET's founders as they built the infrastructure that would carry internet traffic. This investment showed Accel's willingness to bet on long-term trends before they were obvious. Unet eventually became one of the largest internet backbone providers and was acquired by MCI WorldCom for billions of dollars, generating strong returns for Accel. Another early investment was Macromedia, which created software tools for designers and developers building multimedia content. Macromedia's products, including Flash and Dreamweaver, became essential tools for creating websites and interactive content. This investment showed Accel's focus on developer tools and creative software, areas where they built deep expertise over the years. When Macromedia was eventually acquired by Adobe for $3.4 billion, it validated Accel's thesis that tools for creators would become increasingly valuable. But success wasn't guaranteed or immediate. The first fund took years to mature. Some investments failed completely. Some returned modest multiples. The venture capital business requires patience because most returns come from a small number of home runs, not from consistent base hits. Patterson and Schwartz had to convince their limited partners to keep believing in their strategy, keep investing in subsequent funds, and keep giving them time to prove that the prepared mind philosophy would generate superior returns over the long term. What separated Accel from other firms during these early years wasn't just their investment philosophy. It was their approach to working with entrepreneurs. Patterson and Schwartz believed that venture capitalists should be true partners to founders, not just sources of capital. When Accel invested in a company, they didn't just write a check and show up for quarterly board meetings. They rolled up their sleeves and helped. They made introductions to potential customers. They helped recruit executives. They provided strategic advice during difficult decisions. They supported founders through the inevitable ups and downs of building companies. This hands-on approach meant that Accel developed a reputation among entrepreneurs as value-add investors. Founders who had worked with Accel would recommend them to other founders. Technical experts who had seen Accel's work would suggest that promising startups talk to them. This network effect began small in the 1980s but would compound over decades, eventually becoming one of Accel's most important competitive advantages. By the late 1980s, Accel had established itself as a credible technology-focused venture firm. They had made successful investments, returned capital to their LPs, and built relationships across the emerging Silicon Valley ecosystem. But they were still relatively small, still relatively unknown outside insider circles, and still proving that their approach could work across multiple technology cycles. The 1990s would test Accel in ways they couldn't have imagined. The explosion of the internet would create opportunities and risks on a scale that no one had experienced before. The dot-com boom would bring massive capital into venture investing, creating competition and valuation inflation. The dot-com bust would destroy thousands of companies and test whether Accel's discipline could survive the euphoria and devastation of a full bubble cycle. These challenges would forge Accel into the firm that could eventually make the Facebook investment that would define their legacy. The prepared mind philosophy that Patterson and Schwartz built into Accel's DNA was more than just a catchy phrase. It was a systematic approach to investing that created real competitive advantages. While other venture capital firms operated opportunistically, chasing whatever seemed hot or following other investors into deals, Accel developed a different model that would allow them to consistently identify important trends before they became obvious. The first element of the prepared mind was deep domain focus. Accel didn't try to invest in everything. Instead, they chose specific technology domains where they would develop genuine expertise over years. In the early days, this meant networking and telecommunications infrastructure. They studied how data moved between computers, how networks scaled, and what bottlenecks existed. They built relationships with engineers working on networking protocols, with academics researching distributed systems, and with entrepreneurs building networking hardware and software. This focus meant that when an entrepreneur approached Accel with a networking company, the partners didn't need months to get up to speed. They already understood the technology landscape. They knew which approaches had been tried and failed. They knew what the current state of the art was and where the gaps existed. They could quickly assess whether a new approach was truly novel or just a rehash of old ideas. This expertise allowed them to make faster, better decisions than generalist investors who needed to learn about networking from scratch for each new deal. The second element was systematic relationship building with sources of deal flow. Accel deliberately cultivated relationships with people who would see promising companies early. They built relationships with professors at Stanford and other universities who were advising graduate students starting companies. They stayed in touch with early employees at successful companies who might leave to start their own ventures. They developed relationships with technical experts at large companies who understood what problems needed solving. They connected with entrepreneurs they had backed previously, who would refer their friends and colleagues when they started companies. This network meant that Accel often heard about promising companies before other venture capitalists did. An entrepreneur might mention to a Stanford professor that they were thinking about starting a company, and the professor would say you should talk to Accel because they understand this space better than anyone. Or an engineer at a successful Accel portfolio company might decide to start their own company and would naturally reach out to Accel first because they had seen the firm's work and knew they were supportive partners. The third element was patient capital and long-term thinking. Accel structured their funds with 10-year lifespans, sometimes longer, which gave them the ability to support companies through extended development cycles. They didn't need quick exits to satisfy impatient investors. This patience meant they could back companies working on hard problems that might take 5 or 7 or 10 years to mature. It meant they could support entrepreneurs through difficult periods, through market downturns, through pivots and product failures, without panicking and forcing premature sales. This long-term orientation also shaped how Accel thought about valuations. They didn't need to buy companies at the absolute lowest prices because they knew that in truly large outcomes, entry valuation mattered less than picking the right company. If a company could grow to be worth billions of dollars, the difference between investing at a $50 million valuation versus a $100 million valuation wouldn't matter much to returns. What mattered was identifying the companies that could achieve that kind of scale. The fourth element was intensive due diligence that went beyond financial analysis. When Accel evaluated a potential investment, they didn't just look at spreadsheets and business plans. They talked to dozens of people. They called potential customers to understand whether they would actually buy the product. They talked to technical experts to assess whether the technology was real or vaporware. They did reference checks on the founders, calling former colleagues and bosses and professors to understand their character and capabilities. They thought deeply about market dynamics, competitive positioning, and what could go wrong. This thoroughness meant that Accel avoided many investments that looked good on paper but had fatal flaws. It also meant that when they did invest, they had conviction based on real understanding rather than hope based on marketing pitches. This conviction allowed them to increase their investments in winners and to support companies through difficult times when less informed investors might have lost faith. The fifth element was portfolio support that added real value beyond capital. Accel didn't adopt a hands-off approach after investing. They actively helped their portfolio companies recruit executives, using their network to identify talented people and convince them to join startups. They made introductions to potential customers and partners, opening doors that founders couldn't open themselves. They provided strategic advice during critical decisions like when to expand internationally, when to launch new products, or how to respond to competitive threats. They helped with subsequent fundraising rounds, using their credibility to attract other investors. This support created a flywheel effect. Companies that succeeded with Accel's help became advocates for the firm. Their founders and executives would start or join other companies and would turn to Accel for investment. Technical talent would hear about Accel's reputation for supporting entrepreneurs and would be more willing to join Accel-backed companies. This compounding effect made Accel's network and reputation more valuable with each successful investment. the secret that separated Accel from competitors wasn't any single element. It was how these elements reinforced each other to create a system that was hard to replicate. The domain focus led to better deal flow, which led to better investments, which led to more successful companies, which led to stronger relationships, which led to even better deal flow. The patient capital allowed intensive due diligence, which improved investment quality, which generated better returns, which attracted better limited partners, which allowed even more patient capital. The portfolio support created loyalty among founders, which generated referrals, which improved deal flow, which allowed Accel to be selective, which improved quality. Competitors could try to copy individual elements. They could say they had domain focus or that they added value to portfolio companies. But they couldn't replicate the entire system that Accel had built over years. They couldn't replicate the relationships that took decades to develop. They couldn't replicate the pattern recognition that came from seeing hundreds of companies and understanding what differentiated winners from losers. They couldn't replicate the trust that entrepreneurs had in Accel because of the firm's track record of supporting companies through good times and bad. What made this system particularly powerful was that it improved over time. Every investment taught Accel something new about what worked and what didn't. Every successful company added to their network and reputation. Every relationship strengthened created opportunities for future relationships. Every partner who developed expertise could teach that expertise to newer partners, allowing the firm to scale while maintaining quality. This compounding advantage meant that by the late 1990s, when the internet boom was creating thousands of new companies and hundreds of new venture capital firms, Accel had developed capabilities that newer firms simply could not match. They had 15 years of experience investing in networking and internet companies. They had relationships with many of the key technical leaders in Silicon Valley. They had a track record that gave them credibility with entrepreneurs and with limited partners. They had developed frameworks for thinking about internet businesses that came from investing in internet infrastructure before the web existed. But these advantages would be tested severely by what happened next. The dot-com boom of the late 1990s would bring unprecedented capital into venture investing. Valuations would reach levels that made no economic sense. Competition for deals would become fierce as dozens of new venture firms launched with billions of dollars to deploy. Entrepreneurs would have their pick of investors, many of whom were willing to pay higher prices and accept worse terms than established firms like Accel. The temptation to abandon discipline and chase the hottest deals would be enormous. How Accel navigated the boom, and then the devastating bust that followed, would reveal whether their prepared mind philosophy was truly robust or just a strategy that worked in calmer times. The late 1990s would test their patience, their discipline, their conviction, and their ability to maintain their principles when everyone around them seemed to be getting rich by ignoring those principles. The internet boom began gradually in the mid-1990s and then accelerated rapidly. In 1995, Netscape's initial public offering captured public imagination. A company with minimal revenue went public at a valuation of nearly $3 billion. Suddenly, internet companies weren't just interesting technology investments. They were tickets to instant wealth. In 1998, when Google was founded in a garage, there were already dozens of search engines and hundreds of internet companies. By 1999, the boom had become a frenzy. Companies with no revenue and no clear path to profitability were going public at multi-billion-dollar valuations. Venture capital firms were raising massive funds and competing fiercely to invest in anything internet-related. For Accel, this period was both opportunity and danger. On one hand, their expertise in networking and internet infrastructure meant they were perfectly positioned to capitalize on the boom. They had been investing in internet-related companies since before most people knew what the internet was. They understood the technology, the business models, and the challenges better than firms that were just discovering the internet. On the other hand, the flood of capital and the valuation inflation threatened to undermine their disciplined approach. If they stuck to their traditional investment criteria, they might miss out on deals because other investors were willing to pay prices that seemed irrational by Accel standards. Patterson and Schwartz faced a crucial decision. They could maintain their discipline and risk missing the boom, or they could relax their standards and chase deals like everyone else. They chose discipline, but they did it strategically. They continued to focus on companies where they had conviction based on deep understanding. They continued to do intensive due diligence. They continued to build relationships with founders rather than just trying to outbid other investors. But they also recognized that valuations had shifted and that they needed to be willing to pay more than historical norms if the opportunity was truly compelling. This balanced approach meant that Accel participated in the boom but didn't abandon their principles. They made investments in internet companies, but they focused on areas where they had expertise and where they could add value beyond capital. They avoided the most hyped sectors where dozens of competitors were all chasing the same idea. They avoided companies with no business model and no path to profitability. They avoided the consumer internet companies that were spending millions on marketing to acquire users who would never pay for anything. When the bust came in 2000 and 2001, Accel was positioned to survive better than many competitors. They had avoided the worst excesses of the boom. They had maintained relationships with entrepreneurs even when they passed on deals with valuations they thought were too high. They had continued building their expertise and their network rather than just trying to deploy capital as fast as possible. While many venture firms launched during the boom closed their doors during the bust, Accel remained standing, ready to capitalize on the opportunities that would emerge from the wreckage. But the transition from boom to bust was painful. The bust began in March 2000 when the Nasdaq peaked and then began a 2-year decline. Within months, dozens of internet companies were failing. Initial public offerings froze. Venture-backed companies couldn't raise follow-on funding. Valuations collapsed. By the end of 2001, the Nasdaq had lost nearly 80% of its value from the peak. Thousands of internet companies shut down. More than 50 venture capital firms closed. Billions of dollars of investment were written off as total losses. For Accel, this period meant facing failures in their portfolio, having difficult conversations with limited partners about returns, and watching entrepreneurs they cared about lose their companies. But it also meant being prepared for what would come next, when capital would be scarce and the best entrepreneurs would need partners who could provide not just money but judgment, relationships, and support through difficult times. The bust would set the stage for Accel's greatest successes in the 2000s, when they would back companies like Facebook that would define the next generation of internet businesses. The Facebook investment deserves close examination because it reveals how all of Accel's advantages came together at a crucial moment. It wasn't a lucky bet. It was the result of 20 years of preparation, relationship building, and developing frameworks for understanding consumer internet businesses. The story begins in late 2004. Facebook had been running for less than a year, having launched in February 2004 from Mark Zuckerberg's dorm room at Harvard. By the end of 2004, Facebook had about 1 million users, almost all of them college students at elite universities. The company had already received angel funding of $1.5 million, but Zuckerberg and his team knew they needed more capital to scale and to hire engineers. Jim Breyer, who had become Accel's managing partner, heard about Facebook through multiple channels. This wasn't a cold email or a pitch deck sent to Accel's general email address. It was a warm introduction that came through Accel's network. Kevin Efruzi, an Accel partner who focused on consumer internet, had been tracking social networking companies and had heard about Facebook from entrepreneurs and investors he knew. Breyer also heard about Facebook from Peter Thiel, who had made an angel investment and who knew Breyer through Silicon Valley connections. These referrals carried weight because they came from people whose judgment Breyer trusted. In early 2005, Breyer began serious conversations with Zuckerberg. What followed was not a quick deal driven by fear of missing out. It was months of intensive due diligence, multiple meetings, reference checks, and internal debates at Accel about whether to invest and at what valuation. This process revealed how Accel's prepared mind philosophy worked in practice. Breyer and his team did extensive research on social networking. They studied Friendster's rise and fall to understand what could go wrong with network effects. They analyzed MySpace's explosive growth to understand what drove user adoption. They looked at previous attempts at college-focused social networks to understand why none had achieved the traction that Facebook was seeing. They talked to dozens of college students to understand why they were using Facebook obsessively when there were other social networking options available. What Breyer saw was network effects compounding in ways that he hadn't seen before. Facebook wasn't just another social network. It had solved a key problem that previous networks hadn't. By limiting access to verified college students and organizing around real-world social graphs, Facebook felt safer and more authentic than the open networks that had preceded it. Users weren't creating fake personas or trying to meet strangers. They were connecting with people they actually knew, which made the network more valuable as it grew. Breyer also did extensive reference checks on Zuckerberg. He talked to professors at Harvard who had taught Zuckerberg. He talked to early employees and advisors who had worked with him. He talked to other entrepreneurs who had met Zuckerberg. What he heard was a mix of positive and concerning signals. Zuckerberg was clearly brilliant and intensely focused on product quality. He had a clear vision for what Facebook should become. He was willing to make hard decisions and resist pressure from people who wanted him to compromise his vision. But there were also concerns. Zuckerberg was young, only 20 years old, with no previous entrepreneurial experience. He could be difficult to work with, stubbornly refusing advice that he disagreed with. He had turned down acquisition offers from companies that would have made him wealthy, suggesting either confidence or hubris. Most worryingly, Facebook had no revenue model at the time. Zuckerberg was adamantly opposed to intrusive advertising that would degrade the user experience, but it wasn't clear how else the company would make money. Despite these concerns, Breyer developed conviction that Facebook could become something extraordinary. His conviction came from applying frameworks that Accel had developed over years of investing in internet businesses. He saw that Facebook had achieved product-market fit in its target demographic. He saw that user engagement was off the charts, with students spending hours per day on the site. He saw that the network effects were real and defensible. He saw that Zuckerberg, despite his youth, had the key characteristics of great founders that Accel had identified over years of investing. He was mission-driven, product-focused, willing to think long-term, and uncompromising on quality. Breyer also understood something that many other investors missed. The market size for Facebook was much larger than a college social network. He believed that once Facebook dominated colleges, it could expand to other demographics. He could see a path to Facebook becoming the social graph for the entire internet, connecting billions of people and becoming infrastructure for how people communicated online. This vision was contrarian at the time. Most investors who looked at Facebook saw a college directory with a niche user base and no clear business model. The negotiation over terms was intense. Zuckerberg was not a typical 20-year-old founder who would accept any terms to get funding. He had strong opinions about control, about preserving the company's culture, and about the kind of investors he wanted. He interviewed potential investors as much as they interviewed him. He asked detailed questions about their portfolio companies, their approach to working with founders, and their vision for what Facebook could become. Breyer invested enormous time in building a relationship with Zuckerberg. He didn't just pitch Accel's track record and move on. He spent hours talking with Zuckerberg about product strategy, about scaling challenges, about how to build a great company culture. He shared insights from Accel's experience with other fast-growing consumer internet companies. He introduced Zuckerberg to executives from Accel portfolio companies who could provide advice. He made it clear that Accel would be a true partner, not just a source of capital. In May 2005, Accel invested $12.7 million in Facebook at a post-money valuation of $98 million, giving them approximately 10% of the company. By the standards of 2005, this was an aggressive valuation for a company with no revenue. Many venture capitalists thought Accel was overpaying. Some thought the entire social networking category was a fad that would fade. Others thought Facebook would never successfully monetize its user base without destroying the user experience. But Breyer and Accel had conviction based on deep understanding. They had done the work to prepare their minds. They understood network effects. They understood viral growth dynamics. They understood the value of user engagement. They understood that the best internet businesses often took years to monetize but became extremely valuable once they figured out business models. They were willing to bet big on a founder who shared their long-term orientation and their commitment to building something great rather than something quick. What happened next validated Accel's thesis beyond even their own optimistic projections. Facebook's growth accelerated dramatically after the Accel investment. The company expanded from elite colleges to all colleges, then to high schools, then to everyone. User growth became exponential. By 2006, Facebook had 12 million users. By 2007, 50 million. By 2008, 100 million. The company figured out how to monetize through advertising that was less intrusive than competitors because it was targeted based on the rich data Facebook had about users' connections and interests. Accel support during this period was crucial to Facebook's success. Breyer joined Facebook's board and became one of Zuckerberg's most trusted advisors. When Facebook faced challenges, from competition to scaling issues to decisions about whether to accept acquisition offers, Breyer provided counsel based on decades of experience. When Facebook needed to recruit world-class executives to scale from a college startup to a global company, Accel's network helped attract people like Sheryl Sandberg, who would become Facebook's chief operating officer and would professionalize the company's operations. Accel also helped Facebook raise subsequent rounds of financing at increasingly higher valuations. As the company grew, it needed more capital to build infrastructure, hire talent, and expand globally. Breyer used his relationships across Silicon Valley to bring in other top-tier investors like Peter Thiel, Greylock Partners, and eventually Microsoft. These investors added credibility and resources beyond just capital. Accel's presence as the lead investor gave other investors confidence that Facebook was the real deal. The returns from Facebook were staggering. When Facebook went public in May 2012, Accel's stake was worth approximately $6.6 billion. From a $12.7 million investment, that represented a return of more than 500 times in 7 years. For context, most successful venture capital investments return 10 to 20 times capital. Returns of 50 times are rare. Returns of 500 times are virtually unprecedented. The Facebook investment alone returned multiple entire Accel funds and established Jim Breyer as one of the most successful venture capitalists of all time. But the significance of the Facebook investment went beyond financial returns. It demonstrated that Accel's prepared mind philosophy could identify and support the most important company of a generation. It showed that systematic thinking about network effects, user engagement, and founder quality could lead to better investment decisions than following hype or momentum. It proved that patient capital and long-term thinking could generate spectacular returns in an industry that often prioritized quick exits. The Facebook investment also created powerful network effects for Accel. Mark Zuckerberg became one of the most respected entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley. When people who had worked at Facebook left to start their own companies, many of them reached out to Accel first because they had seen the firm's work and trusted them. Facebook alumni became a source of deal flow and talent for Accel portfolio companies. The credibility from Facebook made it easier for Accel to win competitive deals because entrepreneurs wanted to work with the firm that had backed Zuckerberg. However, the Facebook story wasn't without complications. As Facebook grew into a global platform with billions of users, it faced increasing scrutiny over privacy, misinformation, and its impact on society. Breyer and Accel had to navigate the tension between supporting a portfolio company and addressing legitimate concerns about Facebook's power and practices. In 2013, Breyer stepped down from Facebook's board, partly to reduce potential conflicts of interest as he continued making investments in other technology companies. The Facebook investment represents the best-case outcome for venture capital. But understanding Accel's success requires looking at their portfolio more broadly, including investments that didn't work out, the evolution of their strategy over time, and how they adapted as technology and markets changed. Facebook wasn't an isolated success. It was the most spectacular example of an investment approach that generated consistent returns across multiple technology cycles. In the years following the Facebook investment, Accel continued applying their prepared mind philosophy to identify other transformational companies. They recognized that the future of work was changing and invested in collaboration software companies that would enable distributed teams. They saw that mobile computing would transform how people access software and backed companies building mobile-first applications. They understood that software as a service would replace traditional enterprise software and invested in SaaS companies early in their development. One of Accel's most important investments after Facebook was Slack, the workplace communication platform that would transform how teams collaborate. The Slack story reveals how Accel's network effects and pattern recognition capabilities continued working even after they became famous from Facebook. Stuart Butterfield was already a known entity in Silicon Valley when he started the company that would become Slack. He had co-founded Flickr, the photo-sharing service that Yahoo acquired in 2005. After leaving Yahoo, Butterfield started a gaming company called TinySpec in 2009. Accel invested $5 million in TinySpec's Series B round in 2010, along with Andreessen Horowitz. The company was building a game called Glitch, an online multiplayer game with stylized graphics and unusual gameplay. But Glitch struggled to find an audience. Despite beautiful design and innovative gameplay mechanics, users weren't sticking with the game. By late 2012, it was clear that Glitch wasn't going to succeed. Most venture capitalists would have written off their investment and moved on. But Accel had built a relationship with Butterfield and his team. They had seen the quality of the engineering and design work. They believed in Butterfield's ability to build great products even if this particular product hadn't worked. When Butterfield decided to shut down Glitch in December 2012, he had to return money to investors or get their permission to try building something else. Accel, led by partner Andrew Braccia, encouraged Butterfield to keep the $5 million and explore other ideas. This decision reflected Accel's long-term approach to backing entrepreneurs they believed in, even when specific products failed. What Butterfield and his team had noticed was that the internal communication tool they had built for the Glitch team was much more useful than the game itself. They had created a chat platform that integrated with other tools, allowed threaded conversations, had powerful search, and made remote collaboration feel seamless. Team members loved using it and were more productive because of it. Maybe, Butterfield thought, this internal tool could become a product. In 2013, Butterfield's team pivoted from Glitch to Slack. The name stood for Searchable Log of All Conversation and Knowledge. The product was designed for work teams who needed to communicate in real time but found email too slow and disorganized. Slack launched publicly in February 2014 after a beta period that generated enormous excitement. Companies that tried Slack couldn't imagine going back to email and instant messaging tools. The product spread virally as team members told friends at other companies about it. Accel's Andrew Braccia became Slack's biggest advocate inside the firm and in Silicon Valley generally. He helped Slack refine their go-to-market strategy. He made introductions to potential customers and partners. He helped Slack recruit executives as the company scaled. He participated in every subsequent fundraising round, increasing Accel's ownership even as other top venture firms competed to invest. By the time Slack went public in 2019 through a direct listing, Accel owned approximately 24% of the company, one of the largest venture capital stakes in a newly public company in recent history. The Slack investment demonstrated several aspects of Accel's approach. First, it showed their willingness to back the same entrepreneurs repeatedly, even after failures. Many firms would have walked away after Glitch failed. Accel saw failure as information about what didn't work while the underlying capabilities of the team remained valuable. Second, it showed how deep relationships create opportunities. Because Accel had been supportive during Glitch, Butterfield gave them first chance to invest in Slack. Third, it showed pattern recognition about what makes collaboration software successful, drawn from prior investments in companies like Atlassian. Atlassian, an Australian software company that makes tools for software developers, was another crucial Accel investment that revealed their global reach and their focus on developer tools. Accel invested in Atlassian in 2010 through their expansion into international markets. Atlassian's founders, Mike Cannon-Brookes and Scott Farquhar, had built a company with unusual characteristics. They had grown to tens of millions in revenue without taking venture capital, without a sales force, and without being based in Silicon Valley. They built products that developers loved, products like Jira for project tracking and Confluence for documentation, and they sold them through a self-service model where customers could download trials and purchase online without talking to a salesperson. Accel's investment in Atlassian came through their London office, which had been expanding Accel's reach beyond Silicon Valley. The partners recognized that great companies could be built anywhere, not just in California. They saw that Atlassian's model of bottoms-up adoption by developers was powerful and defensible. When Atlassian went public in 2015, it was valued at over $4 billion, and Accel's stake was worth hundreds of millions. The investment validated Accel's global expansion strategy and their thesis about developer-focused companies. Dropbox represented another major success that came from Accel's prepared mind approach. Drew Houston, Dropbox founder, had built a simple product that solved a real problem. Files needed to sync across multiple devices in a way that was seamless and reliable. Existing solutions were clunky and unreliable. Dropbox made file syncing feel like magic. You put a file in your Dropbox folder and it appeared everywhere automatically. Accel invested $7.2 million in Dropbox Series A round in 2007, at a valuation of about $60 million post-money. Other investors were skeptical. They worried that Dropbox was a feature, not a company. They worried that Apple or Google or Microsoft would build syncing into their operating systems and crush Dropbox. They worried that consumer file storage wasn't a big enough market to build a major company. Accel saw something different. They saw that Dropbox had achieved extraordinary word-of-mouth growth. They saw that users became incredibly loyal to Dropbox because it worked reliably when nothing else did. They saw that once people started putting files in Dropbox, switching costs became high. They believed that Dropbox could expand from consumer into enterprise, where businesses would pay significant money for reliable file storage and collaboration. The skeptics were partly right. Apple did build iCloud. Google built Google Drive. Microsoft built OneDrive. All three companies used Dropbox model and integrated it deeply into their ecosystems. But Dropbox survived and thrived anyway because they had network effects, because they had loyal users, and because they adapted by adding collaboration features and expanding into business use cases. When Dropbox went public in March 2018, it was valued at nearly $10 billion. Accel's early investment generated returns of well over 100 times. Spotify, the music streaming service that would transform how people listen to music, represented Accel's ability to identify European companies with global potential. Accel's London team, led by partners including Sonali de Rica, invested $30 million in Spotify in 2011 at a valuation of about $1 billion. At the time, Spotify was growing rapidly in Europe but hadn't yet launched in the United States. The music streaming market seemed crowded, with competitors including Pandora and the upcoming Apple Music. Record labels were skeptical about streaming economics and demanding high royalty rates. But Accel saw that Spotify had solved the licensing puzzle better than anyone else. They had negotiated deals with all major record labels, something previous streaming services had struggled with. They had built a product that made it easy to access millions of songs legally, which was winning over users who had been pirating music. They had a business model with both free ad-supported tiers and premium subscriptions, allowing them to monetize users at different price points. They had passionate users who integrated Spotify into their daily lives. When Spotify went public in April 2018 through a direct listing, similar to how Slack would list a year later, the company was valued at nearly $30 billion. Accel's stake had multiplied by roughly 30 times in 7 years. Beyond financial returns, the Spotify investment showed that Accel could identify market-transforming companies in entertainment and consumer behavior, not just in enterprise software and social media. Flipkart, India's largest e-commerce company, represented Accel's expansion into emerging markets and their conviction that transformational companies would be built outside the United States. Accel's India team, led by partners including Subrata Mitra and Prashant Prakosh, invested in Flipkart in 2009 when the company was small and Indian e-commerce seemed like a risky, difficult market. India in 2009 had limited internet penetration, minimal credit card usage, and logistics infrastructure that made delivering packages challenging. Most Silicon Valley investors avoided Indian startups because they seemed too hard and too risky. But Accel's India team saw enormous potential. They saw that India's population was large and growing. They saw that smartphone adoption would bring hundreds of millions of new users online. They saw that Flipkart's founders, Sachin Bansal and Binny Bansal, understood the local market deeply and were building infrastructure like cash-on-delivery and localized logistics that solved Indian-specific challenges. Accel made multiple investments in Flipkart as the company scaled, participating in rounds in 2009, 2010, and beyond. When Walmart acquired Flipkart in 2018 for $16 billion, it was India's largest ever acquisition. Accel's returns from Flipkart demonstrated that their prepared mind approach worked globally, not just in Silicon Valley. These major successes, Facebook, Slack, Atlassian, Dropbox, Spotify, Flipkart, and many others, represented more than just good luck or being in the right place at the right time. They represented a systematic approach to identifying transformational companies that had been refined over decades. But success rates in venture capital are never 100%. Every firm, including Accel, makes investments that fail or disappoint. Understanding Accel's failures is as important as understanding their successes because it reveals the limits of preparation and the irreducible role of uncertainty in innovation. Not all of Accel's investments worked out as planned. Some companies failed completely, burning through all their capital and shutting down without returning anything to investors. Others succeeded modestly, growing into sustainable businesses but never achieving the exponential growth that venture capital investments require to generate strong returns. Still others faced unexpected challenges that prevented them from reaching their potential, whether from competition, execution failures, market timing issues, or simply bad luck. One category of disappointment involved companies in crowded markets where Accel correctly identified a trend but backed a company that didn't win. In the late 2000s and early 2010s, Accel invested in several daily deals and local commerce companies, inspired by the success of Groupon. These investments seemed logical. Local commerce was a huge market. Smartphones were enabling location-based services. Consumers liked getting deals. But the market became overcrowded with hundreds of competitors, profit margins proved thin, merchant relationships were hard to maintain, and consumers quickly tired of deal fatigue. Most of these companies either failed or sold for modest amounts that didn't return much capital. Another category involved technological bets that proved premature or wrong. Accel invested in several mobile commerce and mobile payment companies before smartphones were ubiquitous. These companies built solutions for problems that would eventually need solving, but the timing was wrong. Without widespread smartphone adoption, the solutions couldn't reach enough users to achieve critical mass. By the time smartphones became universal, these early attempts had run out of capital or been overtaken by later competitors who had better technology and more favorable market conditions. A third category involved founder or team issues that Accel's due diligence didn't catch. Despite intensive reference checks and evaluation processes, some founders didn't have the skills or character to build major companies. Some couldn't scale from early-stage product development to managing large organizations. Some made strategic mistakes that damaged their companies. Some had personal issues or conflicts that destroyed team cohesion. These human factors are incredibly difficult to predict, even with sophisticated evaluation frameworks. The prepared mind philosophy helped Accel avoid some categories of mistakes. They avoided most of the worst excesses of various bubbles because their discipline prevented them from investing in companies with no path to profitability. They avoided many obvious frauds and misconduct situations because their intensive due diligence uncovered problems. They avoided some timing mistakes because their domain expertise helped them assess whether markets were ready for new technologies. But no amount of preparation can eliminate all risk. Innovation is inherently uncertain, and even the best frameworks can't predict all possible outcomes. What separated Accel from less successful firms wasn't that they avoided all mistakes. It was how they responded to mistakes. When investments weren't working, Accel didn't just write them off and forget about them. They tried to understand what went wrong. Was the thesis wrong? Was the execution wrong? Was the timing wrong? What could have been known in advance versus what was genuinely unpredictable. These postmortems became learning opportunities that refined their frameworks and improved future decisions. Accel also practiced portfolio management in ways that maximized returns from winners while limiting losses from failures. They reserved capital to make follow-on investments in companies that were succeeding, allowing them to increase ownership in winners. They recognized failures quickly and stopped deploying additional capital into companies with poor trajectories. They helped failing companies find acqui-hires or soft landings when possible, preserving relationships and reputations even when outcomes were disappointing. This active portfolio management meant that their overall fund returns were strong even though many individual investments failed. The composition of venture capital returns is revealing. In a typical Accel fund, a small number of investments, perhaps 3 to 5 companies out of 20 to 30 investments per fund, generate most of the returns. A few more generate modest positive returns. Many return little or nothing. This power law distribution is normal in venture capital, but Accel's advantage was that their hit rate on home runs was higher than average. Because their prepared mind approach helped them identify truly transformational companies more consistently than competitors, they had more huge winners and fewer complete failures. By the 2010s, Accel had evolved from a Silicon Valley venture firm into a global investment platform with offices in Palo Alto, San Francisco, London, and Bangalore. This geographic expansion reflected a strategic recognition that transformational companies were being built worldwide, not just in California. The expansion also created challenges. How could Accel maintain its culture and investment discipline while operating across time zones, cultures, and markets? How could they ensure that partners in London and Bangalore operated with the same prepared mind philosophy that had been developed in Palo Alto? The London office, founded in 2001, became one of Accel's most successful expansions. Led by partners including Sonali De Rica, Bruce Golden, and others, the London team invested in many of Europe's most successful technology companies. They backed Spotify in Sweden, Rovio in Finland, Supercell in Finland, and many UK-based companies. The London team operated with significant autonomy, making investment decisions locally rather than requiring approval from Palo Alto, but they shared deal flow, portfolio insights, and frameworks with the broader Accel team. The Bangalore office, launched in 2008, focused on India and Southeast Asia. India represented an enormous opportunity, with over 1 billion people and rapidly growing internet and smartphone adoption. But India also presented unique challenges. Infrastructure was less developed than in the United States or Europe. Capital markets were less mature. Consumer behavior and business practices differed from Western markets. Successful companies would need to solve India-specific problems rather than just copying Western business models. Accel's India team developed deep local expertise while maintaining connections to Accel's global network. They understood that e-commerce in India required cash on delivery because credit cards were uncommon. They understood that logistics needed to be built from scratch because existing delivery infrastructure was inadequate. They understood that mobile-first strategies were essential because many Indians would access the internet first through smartphones rather than computers. This local knowledge allowed them to identify companies like Flipkart that would become category leaders. The global expansion created network effects across Accel's offices. A company in the United States might benefit from Accel's relationships in India when expanding internationally. A European company might get introductions to customers in the United States through Accel's Silicon Valley network. Portfolio companies could learn from each other across geographies, sharing insights about challenges they had faced and solutions they had found. This cross-pollination made the whole Accel network more valuable than any individual office. However, global expansion also introduced complexity. Different regions had different capital needs, different typical ownership structures, and different exit environments. Europe had fewer IPOs than the United States, making acquisition outcomes more common. India had regulatory restrictions on foreign investment that complicated deal structures. Each region required partners who understood local conditions deeply, not just people imposing Silicon Valley models on different markets. Accel's approach to these challenges was to hire local talent with deep expertise, give them autonomy to make decisions, but maintain strong cultural connections through regular communication, shared portfolio meetings, and unified limited partner base that invested across all Accel funds. This structure allowed local responsiveness while maintaining global coordination. By the 2010s, Accel's portfolio spanned consumer internet, enterprise software, fintech, healthcare technology, developer tools, gaming, education technology, and many other sectors. This diversification reflected the expanding scope of technology's impact on society. Software was eating the world, as Mark Andreessen famously said, meaning that every industry was being transformed by technology. Accel's prepared mind approach meant they could develop expertise in multiple domains simultaneously, understanding how technology would disrupt banking, healthcare, education, entertainment, and countless other industries. In fintech, Accel invested in companies like Braintree, a payment processing company that eBay acquired for $800 million, and Venmo, a peer-to-peer payments app that became part of PayPal. These investments showed Accel's understanding that financial services would be transformed by mobile technology and that consumer behavior around money was changing fundamentally. In healthcare, they invested in companies applying machine learning to medical imaging, companies building patient engagement platforms, and companies digitizing healthcare operations. In education, they backed companies building online learning platforms, adaptive learning systems, and tools for teachers and students. This sector diversity meant that Accel's performance wasn't dependent on any single market trend. When consumer internet was hot, they had strong performers in that category. When enterprise software dominated, they had winners there too. When fintech exploded, they were positioned to capitalize. This diversification provided resilience through different technology cycles. The prepared mind philosophy evolved as technology and markets changed. In the early days, the philosophy meant deep expertise in networking and internet infrastructure. In the 2000s, it meant understanding consumer internet and viral growth dynamics. In the 2010s, it expanded to include understanding mobile computing, cloud infrastructure, machine learning, and global technology platforms. The specific domains changed, but the underlying approach remained constant. Accel continued investing years ahead of trends, building relationships before they were needed, and developing frameworks for understanding industries before making investments. One manifestation of this evolution was Accel's growing focus on artificial intelligence and machine learning starting in the mid-2010s. While many investors jumped on the AI bandwagon after the breakthroughs in deep learning around 2012, Accel had been investing in machine learning applications for years prior. They understood that machine learning would transform how software worked, enabling capabilities that traditional programming couldn't achieve. They invested in companies applying AI to customer service, to sales and marketing, to cybersecurity, to healthcare diagnostics, and to many other domains. This early positioning in AI came from the prepared mind approach. Accel partners had spent time studying machine learning research, talking to academics working on deep learning, and understanding how computational power and data availability would unlock new applications. When companies started using AI to solve real problems, Accel already understood the technology well enough to evaluate which approaches were credible and which were hype. This knowledge advantage helped them identify promising AI companies early, before valuations inflated and competition for deals intensified. Throughout its history, Accel maintained remarkable consistency in key principles despite adapting to changing technology landscapes. They remained focused on early-stage investing even as some venture firms moved later stage to chase larger deals. They remained founder-friendly, supporting entrepreneurs through challenges rather than replacing them at the first sign of trouble. They remained disciplined about valuations, willing to walk away from overpriced deals even if it meant missing some winners. They remained focused on building long-term relationships rather than transactional deal-making. This consistency created trust with limited partners who had invested in Accel funds for decades. Pension funds, endowments, and other institutional investors knew what to expect from Accel. Returns wouldn't be smooth or predictable, venture capital never is, but the investment approach would be consistent with the prepared mind philosophy. Limited partners appreciated that Accel didn't chase fads or suddenly change strategy based on market conditions. The firm's disciplined approach generated confidence that allowed Accel to raise larger funds over time without facing skepticism about mission creep or strategic drift. By 2020, Accel managed billions of dollars across multiple funds and had invested in well over 1,000 companies. The firm had achieved something rare in venture capital, building an institution that transcended its founders and could sustain excellence across generations of partners. Arthur Patterson and Jim Swartz, now in their 70s and 80s, had gradually transitioned leadership to younger partners while remaining involved as advisors and mentors. This generational transition, always challenging for investment firms that depend on individual judgment and relationships, had been managed thoughtfully over many years. The key to successful generational transition was Accel's emphasis on developing talent internally rather than just hiring experienced partners from other firms. Young investors joined Accel and spent years learning the prepared mind approach, working alongside senior partners on investments, developing their own domain expertise, and building relationships with entrepreneurs. By the time they became full partners with investment decision authority, they had internalized Accel's philosophy and developed the pattern recognition that comes from experience. This apprenticeship model meant that new partners thought like Accel partners, not like the partners at whatever firms they might have come from. The firm also maintained consistency through shared partnership meetings where investments were discussed, through common limited partner base that funded all Accel vehicles, and through unified branding and messaging that emphasized the prepared mind philosophy. New partners heard constantly from older partners about what made Accel different, what mistakes to avoid, and what principles to maintain. This cultural transmission was reinforced through storytelling about past investments, both successes and failures, that illustrated key lessons. However, even with careful transition planning, generational change inevitably brought some evolution. Younger partners had different experiences, different networks, and different perspectives on technology than the founders. They had grown up with the internet, with smartphones, with social media, in ways that shaped how they thought about products and user behavior. They brought fresh energy and new ideas while preserving core principles. This balance between continuity and evolution would determine whether Accel could remain excellent for another 40 years. As Accel entered the 2020s, the venture capital industry had transformed beyond recognition from the world of 1983. The industry had grown from a few $1 billion per year to hundreds of billions. Competition had intensified dramatically, with hundreds of firms competing for the best deals. Valuations had inflated to levels that would have seemed absurd in earlier eras. New entrants, from crossover funds to sovereign wealth funds to cryptocurrency investors, had brought enormous capital and pushed traditional venture firms to adapt or risk being outcompeted. In this environment, Accel's advantages from being early and building relationships over decades remained valuable. They still had pattern recognition from decades of experience. They still had a network that reached across industries and geographies. They still had a reputation that made entrepreneurs want to work with them. But maintaining these advantages required constant work. New competitors could offer higher valuations, faster decisions, or celebrity partnerships that appealed to founders. Technology kept evolving in directions that required learning new frameworks. Global political tensions, from US-China relations to Brexit to pandemic disruptions, created uncertainties that no amount of preparation could fully address. Accel responded by continuing to do what had always worked while adapting to new realities. They maintained their early-stage focus but launched growth funds to support companies in later stages. They maintained their sector focus but added new domains like AI and crypto that were emerging as important. They maintained their founder-friendly approach but developed more structured methods for supporting companies at scale. They maintained their prepared mind philosophy but applied it to new technologies and markets that didn't exist when Patterson and Swartz founded the firm. The COVID-19 pandemic, beginning in 2020, tested Accel's approach in unexpected ways. Suddenly, remote work became universal rather than exceptional. Video conferencing, collaboration software, and digital tools became essential rather than nice to have. E-commerce accelerated by years in months. Digital healthcare and education transformed from future possibilities to present necessities. Companies in Accel's portfolio that supported remote work and digital transformation saw explosive growth. Companies dependent on physical presence struggled. Accel's response revealed the value of having patient, supportive investors during crisis. They didn't panic or demand that struggling companies cut costs to extend runway at all costs. They helped portfolio companies pivot their strategies to address changed circumstances. They helped with customer development as needs shifted. They participated in emergency fundraising rounds to provide capital when public markets were frozen. They facilitated cooperation between portfolio companies that could help each other. This support through crisis strengthened relationships and demonstrated that Accel was truly a long-term partner. The pandemic also accelerated trends that Accel had been tracking. Remote work's sudden universality validated investments in collaboration software. The shift to online everything validated investments in cloud infrastructure. The explosion of digital commerce validated investments in e-commerce platforms. The adoption of telemedicine validated investments in digital health. Companies that had been building for these futures found that their markets had arrived years sooner than expected. Accel's prepared mind approach meant they were positioned in these spaces before the pandemic forced the world to change. Looking at Accel's full portfolio by the mid-2020s reveals the breadth of their impact on technology. They had invested in companies that billions of people use daily, from Facebook to Spotify to Dropbox. They had invested in companies that millions of businesses depend on, from Slack to Atlassian to Qualtrics. They had invested in infrastructure that powers the internet, from networking companies in the 90s to cloud platforms in the 2010s. They had invested in emerging companies that would shape the next decade, from AI platforms to fintech solutions to healthcare innovations. The companies in Accel's portfolio had created hundreds of thousands of jobs, generated hundreds of billions of dollars in market value, and transformed how people communicate, work, consume entertainment, shop, learn, and access services. Some of this impact was undeniably positive, making people's lives better through useful products and services. Some was more ambiguous, creating concerns about privacy, market power, and social effects that even the companies and their investors didn't fully anticipate. Accel, like all major technology investors, had to grapple with the complex consequences of the companies they helped build. The question of investor responsibility for portfolio company impacts became increasingly important. Should investors be held accountable for what companies do with the capital and support investors provide? Do investors have obligations beyond maximizing financial returns? How should investors balance supporting entrepreneurs' vision and independence against concerns about potential harms? These questions don't have easy answers, but they became unavoidable as technology's influence on society grew. Accel's approach emphasized backing ethical founders who cared about building responsibly, engaging with portfolio companies about governance and values, and encouraging thoughtful growth rather than growth at all costs. But the firm also maintained that entrepreneurs, not investors, should make most decisions about their companies. This balance between influence and independence, between supporting founders and providing oversight, remains a tension in venture capital that Accel navigates case by case. The legacy of Accel after more than 4 decades is multifaceted. Financially, they generated exceptional returns for their limited partners, pension funds, and endowments whose beneficiaries include millions of retirees, students, and non-profit causes. These returns enabled institutions to fund their missions and meet their obligations. Strategically, they demonstrated that disciplined, systematic investing based on deep expertise could outperform opportunistic deal chasing. Operationally, they proved that early-stage focus combined with global reach and long-term orientation could build an enduring franchise. Beyond financial and strategic impact, Accel influenced how venture capital is practiced. Other firms studied Accel's prepared mind philosophy and tried to adopt similar approaches. The emphasis on domain expertise, early relationship building, founder support, and long-term thinking became more common across the industry, though executing these principles proved harder than articulating them. Accel also influenced entrepreneurship by helping hundreds of founders build successful companies and by spreading best practices about product development, scaling operations, and building cultures through their portfolio company network. The people who passed through Accel, whether as partners, employees, or portfolio company executives, spread Accel's influence widely. Many former Accel partners left to start their own venture firms, bringing the prepared mind philosophy to new organizations. Executives from Accel portfolio companies took what they learned into subsequent roles at other companies. Entrepreneurs who worked with Accel and then started new companies brought an understanding of how patient capital and supportive investors could accelerate growth. As Accel looks toward its next 4 decades, the challenges are different from 1983 but no less significant. Technology continues evolving in directions that require new expertise, from quantum computing to synthetic biology to new computing paradigms beyond today's internet. Global technology ecosystems continue developing, with major companies and innovation ecosystems emerging in China, India, Southeast Asia, Latin America, and Africa. Competition for deals intensifies as more capital floods into venture capital. Regulatory scrutiny of technology companies increases, potentially affecting future exits and business models. But the core insight that launched Accel remains valid. The future favors the prepared mind. Investors who do the work to understand technology domains deeply, who build relationships before they need them, who develop frameworks for understanding innovation, who support entrepreneurs through challenges, and who think long-term will continue finding opportunities that others miss. The specific technologies change. The geographic centers of innovation shift. The challenges evolve. But the fundamental approach of preparing your mind and backing exceptional founders building important companies remains as relevant as it was when Patterson and Schwartz raised their first fund in 1983. The story of Accel is not finished. The firm continues making investments every year. Some of these investments will fail. Some will succeed modestly. A few might become the next Facebook or Slack, transforming industries and generating extraordinary returns. The exact outcomes are unknowable in advance, inherent uncertainty in innovation. But Accel's prepared mind approach gives them better odds than random chance, better odds than less systematic approaches, and a framework for making decisions under uncertainty that has proven itself across 4 decades and multiple technology cycles. What can we learn from Accel's story? For investors, it demonstrates that systematic thinking about markets and pattern recognition about what makes companies succeed can generate consistently strong returns, even in an industry as unpredictable as venture capital. For entrepreneurs, it shows the value of working with investors who bring more than just capital, who have expertise, relationships, and patience to support company building over many years. For anyone interested in innovation, it reveals how capital allocation decisions shape which technologies develop and which don't, influencing the future in profound ways. The prepared mind philosophy offers lessons beyond venture capital. In any field where the future is uncertain and outcomes depend on judgment under incomplete information, preparing your mind through deep study, relationship building, and systematic thinking improves decision quality. Success still requires some luck. Successful ventures depend on factors beyond anyone's control. But preparation creates more opportunities for luck to work in your favor. Chance favors the prepared mind, as Pastor observed, and as Patterson and Schwartz demonstrated through building one of venture capital's most enduring firms. Accel's journey from a small Silicon Valley partnership in 1983 to a global investment platform with billions under management reflects the explosive growth of technology itself. The companies they backed helped create the internet age we live in, where billions of people carry powerful computers in their pockets, where information and communication transcend geography, where software transforms every industry. These transformations created enormous wealth, generated by companies that Accel identified early and supported through their journeys from garage startups to global platforms. But the story also raises questions about whether this is the world we want, whether the pace and direction of technological change is optimal, whether the concentration of wealth and power that resulted serves society well. These questions don't have simple answers, and people of good faith disagree about them. What's clear is that venture capital firms like Accel played crucial roles in shaping technology's trajectory, making decisions about which ideas received funding and support, influencing which futures became reality and which remained unrealized possibilities. As we look to the future, understanding how firms like Accel operate helps us think more clearly about innovation, capital, and progress. It reveals that major technological transformations don't just happen spontaneously. They result from countless decisions by entrepreneurs, investors, employees, customers, and others who collectively determine which technologies succeed. These decisions are influenced by many factors, from individual judgment and capability to market forces and timing to randomness and luck. But systematic approaches to identifying and supporting important innovations can bend probabilities in favor of progress. Accel's prepared mind philosophy, developed over 4 decades and hundreds of investments, represents one such systematic approach. It won't work for everyone or in all contexts. Different firms develop different advantages based on their history and capabilities. But it offers a proven framework for thinking about innovation and for making better decisions about which ideas deserve support. In a world where technology continues transforming society at accelerating pace, having frameworks for identifying which transformations are likely to succeed and which are likely to matter becomes increasingly important. The companies Accel invested in over 4 decades employed hundreds of thousands of people, served billions of users, and created technologies that changed how humanity communicates, works, and lives. Facebook connected billions of people across the world, for better and worse. Slack transformed how teams collaborate, enabling more flexible and distributed work. Dropbox made files accessible anywhere, changing how people think about documents. Spotify revolutionized music consumption, shifting an entire industry from ownership to access. These impacts extend far beyond financial returns, shaping culture, behavior, and possibilities. Looking back at the Facebook investment from May 2005, we can see how one decision by a venture capital firm, based on months of intensive analysis and years of developing expertise in social networks, influenced the lives of billions of people. That investment wasn't just about generating returns for Accel's limited partners, though it certainly did that spectacularly. It was about providing the capital and support that allowed Mark Zuckerberg and his team to build Facebook into a global platform. Whether that was good for the world remains debated, but it was undeniably consequential. Accel's role in this story was crucial but not determinative. Zuckerberg and Facebook's employees built the company. Users chose to spend time on the platform. Many other investors participated in later funding rounds. But Accel's $12.7 million investment in May 2005, at a moment when Facebook desperately needed capital and validation, enabled what came after. Jim Brayer's support as a board member and advisor helped Zuckerberg navigate challenges. Accel's network provided connections to talent, customers, and other investors. These contributions mattered. The prepared mind that allowed Accel to recognize Facebook's potential in 2005 was built through 2 decades of studying networking, consumer behavior, viral growth dynamics, and founder characteristics. It was built through making hundreds of investments and learning which patterns predicted success. It was built through relationships across Silicon Valley that provided information and credibility. It was built through developing frameworks for thinking about network effects, user engagement, and what it takes to scale consumer internet businesses. None of this guaranteed success, but it dramatically improved the odds. This is what venture capital does at its best: deploys capital to promising but unproven innovations based on systematic judgment about what might work. It's an essential function in innovation ecosystems, bridging the gap between ideas and execution. Without venture capital, many transformative technologies would never get the resources needed to develop. With poorly executed venture capital that just chases hype and momentum, capital gets misallocated to projects that sound exciting but lack genuine potential. With well-executed venture capital like Accel's prepared mind approach, capital flows toward innovations that have real potential to create value and transform industries. The story of Accel, from founding in 1983 through 4 decades of evolution, offers a window into how systematic thinking and disciplined execution can generate exceptional results even in highly uncertain domains like early-stage technology investing. It shows how building expertise, developing relationships, supporting entrepreneurs, and maintaining principles through multiple cycles creates compounding advantages that become hard for competitors to replicate. It demonstrates that success in innovation isn't just about having good ideas or working hard, it's about preparing your mind systematically to recognize opportunities when they appear and having the judgment to execute well when they do. As venture capital continues evolving and as technology reshapes more aspects of society, the lessons from Accel's 4-decade journey remain relevant. Chance favors the prepared mind. Deep expertise beats superficial knowledge. Relationships compound over time. Patience and discipline generate better outcomes than impulsive opportunism. Supporting founders through challenges creates loyalty and generates referrals. Learning from failures and applying those lessons improves future decisions. These principles, simple to state but difficult to execute consistently, explain how two men who started a small venture firm in Palo Alto in 1983 built an organization that influenced technology's development across for decades and continues shaping the future today.